Welcome to No2Nato No2War. If you are one of the 1.8 million people who attended our last meeting, either on the night or in the days and nights subsequently, you already know this. But if you are new here, and I earnestly hope that you are, with no disrespect to the regulars, then please know this. Although an initiative of the Workers' Party of Britain, which I have the great honor to lead, No2Nato No2War is a non-party initiative. It is not in any sense a requirement that you sign up to our political program, although I wish many more of you will do so in the days, weeks, months, and years to come. It is not even a requirement that you oppose all wars. I myself do not oppose all wars. I'm not a pacifist, but I oppose unjust wars. I oppose unnecessary wars. And perhaps above all, I oppose imperialist wars, wars waged to impose the hegemony of the imperial power, the United States of America, and its vassals, its satraps who trail along in its wake. But whether you are any or none of the above, politically speaking, if you oppose the NATO war in Ukraine over the dead bodies of millions of Ukrainian people, the war in Gaza, the war in the West Bank, if you agree with us that the very existence of NATO is a harbinger of war and wars to come, then you are most welcome here. And moreover, we ask you to spread the message about the existence of this great, united, anti-war movement, where whatever your political views on other matters, opposition to these wars right now is the only thing that matters. And you will find on our platforms people of wide and varied political perspectives. They're not responsible for my views, and I'm not responsible for their views. But we have come together, as any sane person must, to try and bring about an end to two wars that are raging and that are pregnant with the possibility of wider regional wars, even of global war, inevitably, of course, thermonuclear in character and containing the possibility of the end of humanity as we know it. Pretty big stakes. Now, we say war on two fronts precisely because we believe that this war is a singular war on two fronts, and with the possibility of further fronts to be opened. A front in West Asia, in the Persian Gulf, against Iran, a front in China, in the Straits of Taiwan, in the South China Sea, because we believe that the war in Ukraine was not begun by the Russian Federation special military operation almost exactly 2 years ago, or coming up for 2 years ago, but began much earlier than that, and as a matter of deliberate provocation by the NATO powers, principally the United States, but in the case of the Ukraine, very definitely heavily involving the European Union, who were out there on the streets giving out the cookies to the assembled mass of ultra-nationalist Ukrainians, tinged with more than a little of Ukrainian historical fascism. But the war in Gaza, which I shall address first, is very definitely an Israel-United States of America affair. Not that others are not participating. To our eternal shame, Britain foremost amongst them. The British are giving over their military base in somebody else's country, in Cyprus, without consultation or permission from the Cypriot government itself, for an endless stream of military resupply of the very shells and rockets, killing the very civilians, men, women, and perhaps above all children, that our leaders then go on television to say they are very much fearful and regretful of the damage being done to the civilians being bombed and shelled by the bombs and shells supplied from British sovereign territory in somebody else's country in Cyprus. So the European Union is now beginning to wring its hands over Gaza. Joseph Borrell, the so-called foreign minister of the European Union, though nobody appointed him or elected him rather to that post, no one can remove him. He's the one who famously described the European Union as a garden and the rest of the world as a jungle. And the principal role of his foreign policy was to keep the jungle out of the garden. Not that that kept the garden out of the jungle, of course, because the European Union was always ready to get involved in interfering in other people's affairs. But Joseph Borrell is now sending out daily heartrending messages of despair, calling for a ceasefire in the murderous rampage against the 2.3 million surviving people in the Gaza Strip. He's never seen anything like it, you understand. He's quite shocked he is. Like the police chief in the movie Casablanca on discovering that there's gambling going on in Humphrey Bogart's casino in Casablanca. I'm shocked, says Borrell, that all these innocent people are being murdered, killed in United Nations headquarters, schools, hospitals, clinics, storehouses. He's absolutely shocked and now wants an end to it, leaving us to wonder, was it the 10,000th dead child in less than 70 days that tipped the balance and made him shocked? Or was, like the rest of us, he shocked as the death toll rolled out in real time on our screens, on our telephones, on our computers? And if you are able still to watch Al Jazeera television on TV itself. The other European leaders, not the British, are beginning to vote for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in the United Nations and in other fora. Not that they're ready to do anything about it. Of course, Russia is still banned from all international competition and jamboree. Israel, however, is still welcome, despite the fact the European leaders are increasingly shocked at the lawless, reckless, bloody mass murder that the country they are still welcoming in to all of their sporting competitions, cultural competitions, and so on. It's the United States of America that is driving the war in Gaza. And even they are beginning to say that, Israel may forfeit the support of the rest of the world if it does not take more care. This is from the country that is supplying the 2,000-pound bombs, unguided bombs. Not that guided bombs are what they crack up to be, but these are literally on the tin, unguided bombs, 2,000 pounds in weight. Something like 3 Hiroshimas of high explosive has now exploded on and in amongst the 2.3 million people trapped in the Gaza Strip. We're nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, even into the sea. Were they to do so, they would still be shelled by the Israeli naval gunboats lined up along the shore. The United States is worried that this horror, which could, of course, continue for many, many months to come and could lead to, frankly, biblical scenes of mass expulsion into the Sinai desert of millions of desperate, bloodied, bowed civilian people, which could lead to a massacre of hundreds, thousands in a single action. They're worried that that will impact the political cycle, the presidential election upcoming in less than 12 months from now in the United States. The US claims to be frankly concerned about the civilian death toll, all the while continuing to make that death toll possible. And now and again, you catch a glimpse of a nascent wish amongst the powers that someone less ugly, less baggage, with less historic blood-stained baggage than Benjamin Netanyahu were in control of events. But I'm here to tell you, it's my melancholy duty to tell you, that the rest of the potential leaders in the state of Israel are even worse than Netanyahu. Getting rid of Netanyahu will not change a thing. The suffering of the Palestinian people for 3/4 of a century did not depend on Netanyahu, or even on Sharon, Begin, Shamir, and the others in his school of Zionism, the revisionist school of Zionism, founded by Jabotinsky, founded and based on the fascist hordes of Mussolini fascism in Italy. It did not depend on them. In fact, most of the biggest crimes committed against the Palestinian people were committed by governments calling themselves Labour, which may come as a surprise to you or may not, in the wake of declassified UK's revelation this evening about the way in which the Labour leader Tony Blair, first, I say first because he went on to make an art of it, first deceived the British Parliament, of which I was a member, over Iraq back in 1998. And I want to add my voice here for those demanding that Sir Tony Blair now be stripped of his knighthood, a proven liar who these new documents show deliberately lied to the House of Commons, cannot continue to enjoy, surely, the King's favour as a knight of the realm. To the other horsemen of the apocalypse, riding hard, roughshod over the people of Gaza, we must now add pestilence, disease, and biblical floods. Anyone who has seen the pictures today of the Palestinian people up to their waists in flood water, in sewage water, for all water and all sewage has long ago been destroyed in Gaza in the course of this Israeli onslaught, carrying old ladies over their shoulders up to their waists in dirty, filthy, disease-strewn water into what remains of the health system in Gaza, which long and long ago passed critical point. We'll realize that the demand for an end to this slaughter is the #1 international imperative in the world today. But what of the other front? Well, all the people you're going to hear from tonight would be entitled to say, I told you so. We probably won't put it quite like that, but no one should be surprised at what the outcome, now visible, is of the NATO war against Russia over the bodies of millions of people in Ukraine, killed, wounded, maimed, and whose lives have been destroyed by the NATO attempt to break up Russia into little pieces, to balkanize Russia into manageable pieces that they could then go on to manage and control. No one should be surprised that Russia has won the war. We three who are speaking to you tonight, all said that that was the only possible outcome. And frankly, although Richard and Dr. Piers Robinson are actually rocket scientists, politically speaking, you didn't need to be. You could have left school at 16 like me, but knew something of the world in order to know that no hyper-nuclear armed country can possibly allow itself to lose a war on its own border, waged by its number one international adversity, that if such an eventuality ever for one moment seemed like a possible outcome, that nuclear war between the superpowers would undoubtedly result. Thank God, so far, that has not been necessary. The slow grind, exceedingly slow grind, of the Russian armed forces has finally begun to prevail on a mass basis against the armed forces of the Ukraine, who fought bravely and who've paid a terrible price for Joe Biden's obsession with a war against Russia. And the only question now is where the Russians will stop. If they wanted to, they could fulfill the regularly expressed worst nightmares of the NATO statesmen and women, the EU statesmen and women. They could be on the Polish border before you could say Dr. Piers Robinson. But I'm going to close my remarks there. I'll come back at the end and invite you to listen to one of the academics of our age, marked not just by academic brilliance, with an ability to put into words thoughts that everyone needs to absorb and learn from, but with that X factor, the X factor of courage. Dr. Piers Robinson has suffered the slings and arrows of the censors, of the shadow banners, of the witch hunters, all for telling the truth. And by the grace of God, the truth marches on and vindicates him and others like him. Please listen to Dr. Piers Robinson, the first speaker tonight on No2Nato No2War. Dr. Piers, a big welcome to you. What's your take on the war on two fronts?
Well, it's very good to be with you, George, and it was very good to hear your comments, and also to say thank you for all the work that you've done over the years in terms of speaking truth to power and to challenging the war machine that we've been living through. What do I make of the situation we're in now? I mean, I think we are definitely at a critical, pivotal moment in Western history. And I sometimes wonder to myself, how far do we take this back in time? And I have in recent years thought more and more along the lines of, well, let's go back to Eisenhower. Let's go back to his famous departing speech, the military-industrial complex. Of course, he coined that phrase, and the warning he delivered. And, you know, you have there this very powerful insight from a departing US president that things are going badly wrong within our political system. Of course, he's talking about the war machine, what was to become the permanent war machine. Kennedy comes in, Kennedy is assassinated, and it's very clear who's responsible for that. You have the escalation in Vietnam, and you have the long course of the 20th century with, it's called a Cold War, of course, but it was not very cold in many parts of the world. Vietnam, Central America, South America, the role of the CIA, the overthrowing of government. And then, of course, we get to the 1990s, and we have this brief moment when Fukuyama tells us that, oh, everything's fine now. We're in an era of peace and democracy, and the world is going to move forward. Then 9/11 comes along, which is clearly an instigated, a manufactured war trigger to start the global war on terror. And that takes us, I think, in the last 30 years, or 22 years, this is the kind of phase in history where we have seen what I think is primarily the gradual and rapid weakening of the Western Empire. And so I started with Eisenhower because for a long time in the 20th century, the West was able to dominate. Of course, it sort of presents itself as having won the Cold War. We had the sort of, in inverted commas, humanitarian interventions of the 1990s. And then with 9/11, we had major conflicts and major engagement in the international system. You mentioned Tony Blair there. And of course, we know now that Tony Blair and George Bush were busily planning regime change wars in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. We know that those wars were planned prior to the 9/11 event. And the wars, Afghanistan, Iraq, and then bleeding through to Syria, Libya, and then to where we are now with this essentially a confrontation with Russia over the Ukraine, and now this terrible situation in the Middle East where genocide is being committed against the Palestinians. I mean, this shows us, I think, how far we have now sort of come in terms of, you know, a strategy of imperial belligerence to maintain Western power. We saw it being, this was what the Project for New American Century was talking about in the 1990s. This is what we've clearly seen rolled out over the last 20 years. But, and this is really coming to my point, it is now very clear that this is, in a sense, a kind of desperate last roll of the dice by the power centers in the West. This is about trying to, as the Project for New American Century documents were saying, well, we've got to take this opportunity to shore up our position in the international system before the next competitors come along, before we have a major geopolitical shift in terms of the distribution of power. And that's what they've been doing. And I think, as you said at the end of your talk, they are very, very clearly losing at this point. We can see it very, very clearly in the Ukraine. I doubt very much whether Israeli-US aspirations can be, in the long run, achieved in the Middle East. It's quite clear that there are tectonic shifts going on. You know, we see Syria coming back into the Arab League. We see relationships between Saudi Arabia and Iran being repaired, and so on. All of this is a powerful sign that the Western Empire is at this point of not being eclipsed, but certainly weakening beyond all recognition. And the kind of belligerence that we've seen and the destructiveness and the blindness that we've seen from our liberal establishment, just soaking up the propaganda, being conned over the Iraq invasion and weapons of mass destruction, being deceived over 9/11, being deceived over Syria, the chemical weapons issue, which I've been involved in building that propaganda narrative. These lies and the propaganda, I think, has reached a peak and becoming extreme now that we're seeing. But it's becoming extreme because the Western Empire is basically struggling now. And I think, in a way, whatever kind of, however hard the permanent war machine pushes to keep going for, some kind of absurd idea that victory can be gained in Ukraine, or Israel can sort of remove Palestinians from all of those territories, however much they believe they might have soaked up their own propaganda and been absorbed in their ideology of Western superiority, they're up against a hard stop now. It's very, very clear that the international system has changed. We have BRICS. We have, across all the categories, whether it's military, economic, or ideational power, that idea of the kind of reputation and credibility of the West, all of those are significantly diminished now. And, I guess my one hope in all of this is that enough people within the Western establishment, the people that you and I have been challenging and pushing back against for a long time, that at least some of them are going to start to wake up and smell the coffee and realize that we can't carry on with this belligerence in the international system. The empire is over. We need to start to find a different way of operating, working with other power centers in the international system. They've got enough failure under their belt now, right? Afghanistan, Syria, and obviously the Ukraine, that maybe there are going to be enough of them who start to realize we need to turn things around. I don't know. Empires can drag on for a long time.
Doctor, let me ask you something. Taking advantage of the fact we've got you here. Are they capable of adopting new ways? Or are they like the scorpion in Aesop's famous fable of the scorpion and the dog, literally unable to do anything other than sting? Does NATO and the empire sting because it is NATO and the empire? Or is it possible that we might be able to so modify their behavior that they become a different animal altogether?
Well, I think there are two things. I mean, one is what I was saying, that, at some point there might be enough people within the establishment who recognize that this cannot be continued unless we risk escalation, right? Unless you risk escalation in the Middle East against Iran or against China. or escalation against Russia in the context of Ukraine, which are just completely unwinnable military situations. That enough people at the top or within these institutions will start to push back. But at the same, so I think there's some reason to believe that might happen. You see a little bit of it in relation to Suez, obviously, in the end of the British Empire over that event. But you also need pushback from the populations as well. And you know, the work that you're doing, No2Nato, you know, there is a big groundswell of popular opinion which is pushing back against the Western war machine. People understand the deceptions in a way that they've never understood them before. You and I lived through Iraq. We did a lot of, you know, I did a lot of academic work on that. You did a lot of real world work in relation to Iraq. But that was an educational moment for a lot of the population about deception. Same goes for 9/11. There's a lot more information out now, and people are recognizing that as, or many more people are recognizing that as a manufactured war trigger. And I think that kind of level of awareness across the population gives us the possibility, I think, to, if they can be mobilized and organized properly, to actually start to exert some real pressure on our political establishments, on the permanent war machine, that the public won't stand for this anymore. So I think, you know, the beast, leopard can't change its spots, but it can, you know, it can start to weaken itself and fail, and with enough public pressure. And then again, this point about the hard stop, the point about the economic, military, ideational reality of the 21st century is an important one, that whatever the Western war machine wants to do, it's going to come up against powerful resistance, whether it's China or Russia or on Gaza, Israel. Look at the public support for the Palestinians globally. It's huge. I haven't seen anything like this in my sort of, you know, in lifetime. So I think those pressures might force a change. And as I say, the only other route is ever greater military failure if we go to escalation, ever greater isolation of the West in ideational terms, with people, you know, people who've woken up to the Western Empire, people who've woken up to what happened in Vietnam or Central America or South America, the overthrowing regimes, or the global war on terror conflicts, that's all in recent memory. That's going to produce the kind of momentum, I think, to bring this to an end. But I would emphasize for sure that public awareness is critical in all of this. And I think, you know, but I can see this across Europe, right? I mean, it was Zara Wagenknecht, I think, who organized an anti-war demo in Berlin at about 2 weeks' notice, about half a year ago. I think Jeffrey Sachs was piped in to give a little talk. But, you know, we were at the Brandenburg Gate, and I think there was well in excess of 50,000 people mobilized at short notice at the height of the propaganda over the Ukraine, people being told, you've got to support Ukraine, von der Leyen going out and pushing the boat out, etc. And the sense I got was a really strong, sort of palpable sense on the streets and amongst the population in Germany, where I lived, that, you know, people weren't buying this and have had enough of these wars and recognize the deception in a way they haven't before. So, you know, that can all, I think those are all reasons to think that we are at this pivotal moment, with people pushing hard enough, such as yourself, you know, and anti-war movements and so on, as well as the rest of the world pushing back. And that, you know, that feeds back through the diplomats, right? You can see it happening in the UN. You know, diplomats are going back, you know, we're getting a really hard time on the floor. You know, this is over Gaza and Israel. So, you know, the moment has come. They just need to wake up to reality. And, you know, the liberal power center or the extreme center, whatever you want to call it, those people who read the Guardian and the Times and delude themselves that the West is best and we need to lead the world, that small community, I think, is going to shrink and shrink and shrink. And maybe they'll never wake up to what they've been involved in. But I think the writing is on the wall. Slightly optimistic on my behalf, but I
don't think it's over optimistic at all. Writing on the wall, waking up, smelling the coffee. Thank you, Dr. Piers Robinson. We'll come back to you before the close of the meeting. Richard Medhurst is a prolific and powerful broadcaster whose quick takes on big events are almost always absolutely correct. Bullseye after bullseye. has been scored by him on air, oftentimes within minutes of great events. For one so young, he's a very wise man. Richard Medhurst, the broadcaster and activist, joins us now. Richard, Dr. Piers was talking there about a pivotal moment. Of course, the point about a pivot is that it can turn either way. How do you see the likely outcomes of this pivotal moment on the two fronts we're talking about here, Ukraine and Palestine?
Hi, George. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate the introduction, and it's great listening to you and Piers, and I admire your work and everything you've done for the anti-war cause. You know, we are at a pivotal moment. What's happening is that the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza, they are related. What the West is dealing with now is the downfall of its empire. So they see over 150 countries signing up to the Belt and Road Initiative or the New Silk Road, which would revive the most famous trade route in history. And they feel threatened by that. There's no need to be threatened, but because it's based on a capitalist monopoly, they perceive any competition as a threat. And so they see also the expansion of BRICS. I covered it, and they more than doubled their membership. And of course, these include countries now like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which could go either way. I think they're just looking out for what they're basically making sure that whatever happens, they will have a seat at the table, whether the West comes out on top or it's the multipolar world. But it's not looking good for the West. They've been trying now for a long time to put together this plan. So what they've done is they blew up Nord Stream 1 and 2, and before that they had already put sanctions to remove Russian gas flowing into Europe. Then with Iran, Donald Trump pulled out of the nuclear deal, and he reimposed the sanctions on Iran in violation of the agreement, and they cut off Iranian oil and gas. Remember, Russia and Iran are the two countries with the largest proven reserves of natural gas on the planet. And then when it comes to Gaza, Gaza also has gas. They discovered during a survey that in the Mediterranean Sea, so on the Levantine coast, you have what is called the Levantine Basin, and this gas field is called Leviathan. And so Syria, Palestine, Lebanon have enormous amounts of gas. It's not the only reason for the war in Gaza. This is obviously Israel is founded on Zionism, which is racist, and they've occupied Gaza before, and there are many reasons for the war. But one of the economic incentives is certainly the gas, and we know this because the Israelis, while claiming that they are under existential threat after October 7th, were handing out licenses to 12 companies, including British ones like BP, to extract gas. So it doesn't sound like much of an existential crisis if you're extracting gas, but they did that. And then if you remember the Lebanon crisis, so the Beirut port mysteriously blows up, and then 2 years later, so just last year in 2022, the Israelis send an FPSO, which is this enormous vessel that can extract gas on the go, and they try stealing gas from Lebanon in this Leviathan Basin in the Karish gas field. And the only reason they backed off in the end is because Hezbollah threatened to fire on them. They said, if you steal any of our nation's resources, we will fire upon you. And then Biden sent Amos Hochstein, who's his special envoy, to mediate, and they settled this maritime border issue. But just to recap, so Gaza is under siege since 2007. You can't even fish, let alone extract gas. The Beirut port is out of action, and Syria's Latakia port, Israel bombed that too and put it out of action. So the only major port left on the Mediterranean coast, in the Levant, is Haifa, which is controlled by the Israelis. And this is great because now they can monopolize the flow of gas into Europe. You got rid of Iran, you got rid of Russia, and you got rid of the Arabs. And then what happens magically? The Israelis propose themselves as the solution to the EU's gas shortages, and they signed a deal after sanctioning Russia. They signed this, and Ursula von der Leyen went there and said explicitly, Israel is going to be the solution to our gas problem. And so, of course, the Americans, they want to sell their own gas, liquefied natural gas, LNG, but the exclusion of the global South and the theft of resources is a plan that's been in the making for a long time. I mean, the Americans, this goes back several administrations where they've said they don't want any gas, Russian gas, coming into Europe. So, these things have come into play. And we shouldn't forget also the Ben Gurion Canal. This is a canal that was, I think Piers mentioned the Suez crisis just earlier. In 1956, after Nasser, the Egyptian president, dared to nationalize his own land, the Americans and Israelis came up with a secret plan to create a rival to the Suez Canal, and they named it Ben Gurion. And they had a plan to put 520 nuclear bombs in the Negev desert to excavate and dig the canal for them. They didn't go ahead with it, but it's a classified document. It was declassified in the 90s, and they came up with this in 63. So if you look at the map of this proposed Ben Gurion Canal, it literally passes through Gaza. So if you want to build that canal and monopolize not just the gas, but the shipping lanes, you have to take over Gaza. You can't have any resistance. You can't have anyone, quote unquote, annoying you. And the Israelis, either way, they want to kill the Palestinians and take their land. So it's like two birds with one stone. No one is going to use this proposed canal if you've got rockets flying all the time. It's just not going to work. So we shouldn't forget that this is also an important part of their plan. And they're doing all of this because they're in crisis. When we look at the New Silk Road, this will go from China all the way to Syria, and then it has access to the Mediterranean Sea. And Piers also mentioned that Syria was brought back into the fold, into the Arab League and into the international community. And what did President Assad do just before October 7th? He went and visited China. So this, of course, makes the Americans very angry because China is the world's largest economy. And Syria and China signed a strategic partnership. The reason for this is so that the New Silk Road would have access to the Mediterranean Sea, which is pivotal, as we're talking about. And Iran and Iraq at the same time signed a railway deal, which expands railway access and completes this entire axis of trade, land-based and maritime. So Netanyahu went to the UN and he holds up this map, and this is just before October 7th, and he declares his plan for a new Middle East. What it really is, it's a rival to the Silk Road. So, once again, the wars that we're seeing in Ukraine and Gaza, we have to talk about the historical context. We have to talk about occupation. We have to talk about Israeli occupation and NATO expansion. They are absolutely the reasons behind these wars, but we shouldn't forget that there are these massive economic incentives and this crisis, this existential crisis in their minds of these Western leaders, that they have to compete against the global South. They have to steal the resources. They have to control the shipping lanes, and that's not turning out very well for them, is it? I mean, just today, Yemen, they fired at one ship and very narrowly missed, and then they ordered another one to dock in Yemen, and the Red Sea is basically closed now entirely to Israeli ships. So this is what all Arab countries should be doing, because all the crucial maritime straits and trade routes pass through Arab countries. You've got Gibraltar, which is near Morocco. You've got the Suez Canal, which is through Egypt, and then the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, Yemen, and the Strait of Hormuz between Iran and Oman. So, if Arab leaders, if we had real Arab leaders instead of these Western stooges, they would have shut down the Suez Canal from day one. They would have shut all these straits, no Israeli ships, no Western ships, and they would stop bombing Gaza within 30 minutes. That's the only language they understand. And an oil embargo, of course, would help to deal a significant blow. It's very important to tie these things together, because when you understand the racist reasons behind the Israeli occupation, you understand the nefarious nature of NATO expansion. You also need to add to that the economic incentives. They are important. They wouldn't go to these lengths if they weren't important, and they wouldn't be trying to control all the shipping lanes, destroy and sabotage the Silk Road. And the way the Americans are trying to do that is, we should remember, they occupy 1/3 of Syria. They've been trying to take the regions of Hasaka and Deir ez-Zor and link them up with their base at Al-Tanaf, which would completely cut off the Syrian border from Iraq. And that way, this new Silk Road would be sabotaged. And they also tried stopping Iraq from repaying Iran for its fuel. So these things, they must be taken into account. They must be put into context, and they really expose the self-destructive nature that our leaders are putting us through. And it's stupid, because there's no need to rival China or to rival Iran. The Belt and Road Initiative is not exclusive it doesn't leave out Western countries. We could easily join. Italy tried joining, and then they left because of American pressure. We could easily get along and get on with the Chinese, with the Iranians, with the Russians, and the rest of the world and the global South. But our leaders choose not to, and they have to be replaced. They have to go. They don't represent the will of the people. You can't tell me that all these people coming out and protesting, are represented by their governments. They're not. Western countries are inherently anti-democratic, because you can see on television every day people are protesting. They don't want the West to support Israel, and the leaders don't care, and they go ahead and support Israel anyway. So this is not democratic. This doesn't represent what people want. And if people knew the truth, if we had a proper media and proper education system, even more would come out in opposition to this pathetic foreign policy, this aggressive imperialist foreign policy. We need to find a way to return to humanity, to civility, and learn to live with others, because this is going to screw everyone in the West in the end.
Humanity, civility, and living with others. Richard Medhurst, thank you for that very, very powerful tour de horizon. Turning finally to you for a roundup, Dr. Piers Robinson. Richard makes the point that while there are very palpable, powerful, material reasons for Israel's onslaught in the Gaza, the gas, the canal, and so on, there is an element, a more, if you like, primordial element to this. And it is the supremacism, the idea that fueled the westward expansion of the European settlers in North America, for example, the idea that somehow God, that manifests destiny, had given them not just the right, but the responsibility to steamroll any and everybody who was there, because by definition those people were less than them, that they represented some kind of savagery which we savagely exterminated and annihilated. My take on Israel is that they are, if you like, a 21st century reincarnation of that 17th, 18th century force that exterminated the original American people, 100 million of whom were massacred from the north of America all the way to Chile. What's your view on that?
Well, I think that's correct. I mean, if you look at the Zionist ideology, and my colleague David Miller does extensive work on this, as you know full well. I mean, the ideology is based upon a notion of supremacy. And, this is clearly not a million miles away from the Western Empire and what we have seen over hundreds of years. I think, Rich was absolutely right tying in, that there is an interweaving between core material interests, battle over resources, and then the ideologies and the belief systems. And there's probably an interplay between the two, but you have to understand all of these things in order to understand the motivations. And I guess, where that puts us in the West is, we have this supremacist ideology, which you can trace back through hundreds of years. It underpins the empires, the imperialism, etc., that we've seen over the last 400 years, is underpinned, as you rightly point out, the legitimation of the wiping out of indigenous populations in multiple settings. So you have this wicked combination between a sense of supremacy and then the kind of core interest, the driven greed, the desire to accumulate, and the desire to exploit in order to shore up our societies, our countries, and so on, and to be on top of the world. And so I think these things have interwoven, and this has been the truth behind the West. The liberal mask has created a facade, has blindsided many people in the West as to the reality of what's going on. We think we're we don't do things, we don't go to war for economic reasons. We're here on the side of good and so on, and et cetera, et cetera. And that has always masked this kind of sense of supremacy, this superiority, which I think is still in there, even amongst those sort of liberals who like to lay claim to being sort of progressive and so on. Sort of, you know, when they're sort of really sort of dig down deep, you'll see that they have a kind of essentially a supremacist attitude towards world politics. And as Richard said, you know, we have to now start to learn to recognize that we cannot no longer dominate for all the reasons we were talking about before. And we need to start to, you know, not just act, but also think in terms which recognize the equivalence of other power centers, of other societies in international system in a way that we haven't before. So it's kind of this perpetual sort of belief in, you know, people should be following the lead of the West. And you see it in all the discourse around, you know, international rules and so on and so forth, and the international community, which is really essentially the West. That mindset, which has gripped the mind of Western diplomats and political establishments for many, many years, needs to come to an end. And that's going to require this recognition that we need to see ourselves as equals to other power centers in the international system, and to find ways of cooperating. And as Richard said, there's no obvious lose in all of this. This is a new reality for the West, but it will be a better one for most of the Western populations. I suspect at the moment that, you know, there are elements within the military-industrial complex who are benefiting well from the arms sales and from the war and the conflict, but that's a very narrow strata of Western society. Most people don't want this. This isn't good for most people in the West. And so, you know, I think that that's going to push through and change things at this point in time.
Dr. Piers Robinson, thank you very much indeed for your wisdom and eloquence. Richard Medhurst, the last word to you. You and I both, you more than I even, although we both have blood on both sides, East and West. It is quite laughable for those who know, for example, Syrian society, or who I was once confronted at the Oxford Union with someone who said we needed to educate the Iraqis. And I was forced to point out that the Iraqis had the greatest library in the world and were teaching algebra and geometry when my people were painting their faces blue and living in the forest. It is quite a laughable idea, this Western racial supremacy, this garden jungle analogy. It must be galling, maybe it's amusing in part, when confronted with the idea that Joe Biden and Donald Trump and George W. Bush somehow represent a superior cultural society, civilization to Johnny Arab in Damascus, the world's oldest city. Last words, last thoughts from you, please.
Yeah, it really is laughable, George. And as you said, I mean, Iraq and Syria are truly the cradle of civilization. There's a former director of the Louvre Museum in Paris who said that every person in the world has two nationalities, their own and Syria, because you know because of how relevant and important it is to human civilization. I mean, this goes without saying. You know, farming, agriculture, writing. I went to Ugarit when I was young to the archaeological dig, and I saw, you know, this is where the first musical notes were ever written, the first alphabet in the world, and it's heartbreaking to see these wars not only kill people, which is the primary crime, but also destroy and ransack their antiquities. I mean, the arch in Palmyra was blown up. I was lucky enough to see it when I was young, but you know, seeing a 3D basically a reconstruction of it in Trafalgar Square is almost insulting when you know, our government helped to destroy that, the original one in Syria, by supporting all these you know, loony jihadists and trying to topple the Syrian government, along with, you know, a lot of EU countries, the US, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar, and so on. It's really laughable and insulting at the same time. And during the 2003 invasion, the Americans also went to the ancient city of Babylon, and they built a helicopter pad on top of it and filled their sandbags, with pieces of this ancient city, which is, I mean, I really struggle to find words to articulate how ignorant this is. It's truly shocking, because it's not only an affront on Iraqis, it's an affront on human civilization and history, on everyone's. So this idea that we represent like a superior civilization in the West, I don't know. It's like Piers was saying, this is propaganda, indoctrination that we have to, that people, leaders in the West tell people in order to help them rationalize in their heads these horrific acts that they go and commit when they invade Iraq, when they murder people face to face in Afghanistan, or when the Israelis are killing Palestinians. They're indoctrinated, they're brainwashed into thinking they're superior. Another thing that I would also like to add is that right now, and not just now, but for decades, they've been trying to portray any resistance in the Middle East as exclusively Muslim. This feeds Islamophobia, because they want to say basically that all Muslims are terrorists, and it's first of all, it's insulting, and it's also just wrong. I mean, the resistance in Palestine was pioneered by Christians, not only Christians, but many Christians like George Habash. Right now, George Abdullah is still in prison in France. He's the longest political prisoner in Europe, 40 years in prison, denied him parole over and over and over because he resisted against the Israelis. There's also the Catholic Bishop Kabuchi, who smuggled arms into the West Bank to help Palestinians resist. These are all Christians, and I know it goes without saying that you have Christians in the Middle East, obviously, because the religion comes from there. But it is Christmas soon, and there is a war in Palestine, and they are trying to paint people as Muslim extremists. So it is important to re-explain that Jesus was a Palestinian. That you have Christians, you have Jews amongst Arabs, of course. That's where these religions come from. And when Hamas or Hezbollah or the Yemenis are fighting against American and Israeli occupation, they are fighting for all occupied peoples in the Middle East, whether they're Jewish or they're Christian or they're Muslim. The religion is irrelevant. I think that's important to recall, especially as Christmas is in 2 weeks. People are going to be singing Christmas carols and all these things while Jesus' birthplace is being bombed. I mean, the irony of that is, it's very heartbreaking, and it's worth repeating, because the West have used Christianity as part of their agenda in controlling the place that Christianity comes from. So there's a huge irony there that people in the West want to lecture the inheritors of these three major religions about their own religions and culture. So it's worth pointing out. As long as countries, especially Western countries, attack the cradle of civilization, this will always be a major contradiction, and there's absolutely nothing superior about that. Superiority is diplomacy, is peace and humanity. That's what it means to actually be superior, so to speak, figuratively. But it goes without saying that if we care about international law, if we care about human rights, we can't support Israel and we can't keep bombing other countries. These are direct contradictions, and it's certainly un-Christian behavior.
Richard Medhurst, Dr. Piers Robinson, thank you both for your wisdom and eloquence on this public meeting of No to NATO, No to War. It is indeed Christmas time. I myself was in a nativity play in the audience just yesterday. And there will be millions of these nativity scenes enacted by innocent, pure children in schools all over the world. And it is important to take this opportunity to make clear that the idealized scene of Bethlehem that is the backdrop to the whole nativity story is, of course, as Richard just pointed out, so at odds with the situation of the birthplace of Jesus this very day, being bombed, being raided, its people being killed, being captured, blindfolded, manacled, tortured, killed, being locked up by checkpoints that are forever closed between the great city of Jerusalem and Bethlehem, only a few miles apart. It would take you many hours indeed to travel between the two. If Mary were on her journey this evening, Jesus would be giving birth at a checkpoint. If indeed the mother, the Holy Mother, Mary, was not murdered at the scene of the crime in Bethlehem. Nazareth, from whence the family had traveled, is in bondage. So-called Arab Israelis live there. Increasingly endangered species, subject to pogrom like the pogroms which occurred 60 days ago in the great Palestinian city of Haifa, to which Richard just referred as now the only existing superport in the entire Levantine coast, thanks to the deliberate actions of Israel. Nazareth is in bondage. Bethlehem is under siege. Jerusalem's ancient alleyways run with the blood of the believers, both Christian and Muslim. One of the oldest Christian churches in the world, in Gaza, was destroyed in this Israeli onslaught. And yet Christian leaders, even church leaders, with the exception, rather belatedly, of His Holiness the Pope, but most Christian church leaders haven't said a word about the slaughter and murder going on right now in the Holy Land. And as for these frauds, these snake oil salesmen and women who wear their Christianity on their sleeve as they run for political office, they probably don't even know what I'm talking about. It's been marvelous for me. I hope it was for you. This has been a public meeting brought to you by No2Nato No2War. Please follow us on all platforms on social media. Join us. No2Nato No2War. It remains only for me to thank the Workers' Party film and communications cadre who do such great work on these occasions. To Alan, to Sean, and to Chris, thank you for all your work setting up this meeting and bringing it to what I hope will be an even bigger mass of the global public than viewed the last meeting, 1.8 million strong. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time with the latest story from the war on two fronts. I've been George Galloway. You've been a wonderful audience. Thank you for joining me.